My name is Jared Jones, and I'm an associate licensed mental health counselor here at Care to Change. I specialize in working with teens and young adults who struggle with anxiety, depression, suicide, self-harm, trauma, and all kinds of other mood and impulse related difficulties. I've been working at Care to Change for about a year and a half now, and I'm here to talk to you about video game use and video game addiction. Today's topic is my kid addicted to video games? And we all know that this is important because video game usage is on the rise. In fact, most kids nowadays have access or have played some kind of video game. According to the Recovery Village, an online article by them in 2020 said that about 64% of the US population, almost 2/3, reported playing a video game at some point. So we know that this is a prominent thing, especially among kids and minors, and eventually into young adulthood. We see a lot of that. Most people, or males actually between the ages of 18 and 24, tend to have the highest risk of video game use disorder, which we'll talk about that a little bit later. But they tend to be the age group that struggles the most, and these problems usually start in childhood or in their teenage years. Video game usage and addictive use, as we know, is on the rise. Currently, the diagnosis for video game use disorder is being researched and studied. It's not an official diagnosis that you can get for your kids yet, but it's being compared to a lot of other addictive disorders, such as gambling disorder, that are actual diagnoses that you can receive. We know that just because of the rise of video game use, your child is going to be exposed to video games at some point. And so it's important to know about the signs and symptoms of video game use disorder, of video game addiction, and how to be able to step in and get someone help or be able to help them get away from some of these dangerous usages. So the prevalence of video game use disorder is about 1 to 0.5%. In the adult population, and that's by a study by Purinsky, Weinstein, and Murayama in 2016. I know that that study is a few years old, but we know that just worldwide, we are beginning to see an increase in the video game use, and some other countries have even reported higher percentages of video game use disorder or video game addiction, if we'll call it, in their populations. The Recovery Village again states that anywhere from 1 to 10% of gamers actually report criteria of video game use disorder. So if someone is a gamer, they have about a 1 in 100 to a 1 in 10 chance of actually developing video game use disorder. What you should know as a parent of a kid who maybe uses video games, or you begin to see some of those symptoms, you begin to see them use video games quite a bit, is that you don't have to think of it as an actual addiction or a normal addiction. In fact, a lot of the criteria for which video game addiction is labeled doesn't meet criteria for other addictive disorders. There's actually a difference between video game use addiction and other addictions such as drug or alcohol use. With video games, you're struggling with the reward of doing something well in the game or playing the game over and over again. The one thing that's common across all addictions is actually the neurochemical dopamine. And this is a chemical that's part of a lot of our processes in the brain. But one of the processes that it's involved in is actually reward. Whenever we do something good and we feel something about it or feel good about it, or whenever we just feel good about other things in general, like seeing a friend or getting to eat our favorite food, we actually get a hit of dopamine. And what that dopamine does is it reinforces us to want to do that again, to repeat that pattern. Most things that we get a dopamine hit from aren't that powerful of dopamine. Like we feel good about it, but it doesn't compel us or give us the impulse to do it over and over again. It's just something that we take as pleasurable and we're like, yeah, I would love to see that friend again. Or for sure, next time I'd like to go back to this restaurant, I would get the same meal. How addictions work is they become things that cause a strong enough dopamine hit that it becomes obsessive. It becomes addictive. So what happens is, like, we'll use, say, drug addiction, for example. A lot of illicit, illegal, and sometimes prescription drugs will cause enough of a dopamine hit that our body becomes used to it. It becomes dependent on that specific dopamine response, and thus it creates that need for us to go back and do it over and over and over again. Sometimes other things can trigger this, such as too much use of sugars or fats in food, and even in other things like gambling or social media addiction, where we begin to get so used to the dopamine hit from these activities that our body becomes dependent on it. It needs that dopamine to feel good about ourselves or to feel complete in our day. And this is something that can happen with video games as well. But the difference is that not everyone responds to video games the same, and video games don't always create a strong dopamine hit. Now, video games with the flashing lights and sounds and the involvement in it, whether you get lost in a world or you're playing with friends, is an enjoyable activity for most kids. So a lot of times they're gonna get dopamine hits off of it. It's a normal thing, as if they were playing outside with their friends or watching one of their favorite movies. And we wouldn't consider those things to be addictive. But what we want to watch out for is when someone becomes too dependent on those specific video games or video game related behaviors, to where that becomes compulsive. It becomes something that they go to, that they run to all the time. It's their comfort zone, or whenever they're stressed, that's what they're seeking after. Some of the criteria that this video game use disorder actually requires, and it's any 5 of these could get the diagnosis, but I share these with you to look out for some signs and symptoms that may give an indication that your child or someone you know may be struggling with a video game use disorder. Preoccupied or obsessed with online video games. It's all they talk about. It's everything they're spending their money on, that sort of thing. Experience withdrawal symptoms when not playing. So withdrawal is an experience we have with any addiction, where when we're away from the thing that's been giving us that dopamine hit long enough, we actually begin to feel bad. Our mood begins to drop. We begin to get withdrawal symptoms where we feel irritable. We may feel emotional. We may begin to feel tired or restless. There's all kinds of symptoms that can be involved with withdrawal, and those symptoms will immediately go away when we go back to the mean. So when someone goes back to the thing that they've been using in an addictive pattern, it makes those withdrawal symptoms go away. Having tolerance build up is another symptom of a video game use disorder or video game addiction. Tolerance is basically that it takes more and more of whatever was giving us the dopamine hit to create that same amount, that same level of dopamine that that first dose had given us. So for instance, within a person who say struggles with alcohol use, instead of drinking maybe 3 servings of alcohol to get their dopamine hit, they all of a sudden need to drink 5. And then a couple months down the road, it takes 7. And then down the road, it takes 9. And it just keeps building up and up for them to get that same level. And you basically become more and more dependent on higher levels of whatever it is that you are struggling with feeling addicted to. And this can happen with video games too, where, instead of playing video games for an hour, well, to feel good, I have to play it for 2 hours. Well, to feel good, I have to play so many rounds of this. Well, to feel good, I have to perform at this level with this. To feel good, I have to buy these things in the game. And it just becomes more and more obsessive and dependent, to where we build up more of a tolerance to it. And, the regular amount of video game use that maybe was okay at first, say like, 1 hour a day or playing it every other day, now is not enough to feel satisfying. And we have to do it more and more to get that same level of dopamine. Another symptom of video game use disorder is like having tried to stop or cut back on video game use and failed to do so. When you have those withdrawal symptoms and you build up that tolerance, it's hard to break out of the wake of struggling with that use in any addiction whatsoever. And so if you've, felt like, well, I've tried to get out of it, but I couldn't get out of it. I've tried to go a week without it and I found myself returning right back to it. That's a sign that you're struggling with an addiction or those troubling symptoms with stopping. So if you notice your child or someone is unable to stop, or when they try to stop, they find themselves giving in and going back to it, that could be another sign. And another symptom for the criteria is having lost interest in other activities or hobbies. So if video games begin to consume every part of their life and not just, a side hobby or something that they do, like they lose interest in spending time with friends in real life because they'd rather spend time with them online. They lose interest in any other hobbies or activities like being outside or playing in sports or other things of interest, things that are in the real world. When those fall away and those no longer become enjoyable, that's also one of those criteria and signs of video game addiction. Other criteria could be keeps overusing the video games, knowing the impact. So being able to, or continuing to use video games, knowing that this is going to take me away from, maybe time that I could rather be spending with friends, or sitting with these video games instead of going out and exercising is going to make me continue to gain weight or become unhealthy. Playing this video game makes me skip meals. Knowing that it's causing harm, but still not able to stop yourself and still continuing to follow through with the behavior is another sign of that. Other criteria include lies about gaming, games to escape feelings of anxiety or guilt, so it becomes a coping mechanism, or loss or risk of losing relationships, love relationships with loved ones. They no longer have friends. They no longer connect with their spouse, things like that. So all of those are general things to look out for if you know someone or you yourself may be struggling with video game addiction, especially in your kids. Now, I want to be clear that some of these criteria could be present or could appear to be present, even when your child or someone you love is not actually struggling with this video game use. Some of these things may be very normal things, such as if someone's favorite pastime or hobby is video games, it may appear that they have become obsessed with the video games. But what's important is to realize, are they needing this to survive? Can they stop if they need to stop? Or is this just something they enjoy so much and they, spend so much of their time on? This is the way they connect with their friends, that this is just a normal hobby for them. That's what we really need to pay attention to. So as you've heard this criteria, don't self-diagnose yourself or your kids or feeling like they meet all the criteria. Take them into a professional to get that actually diagnosed. So that way you can be able to distinguish whether this is normal or maybe a little bit of overuse behavior, or if it is actually on the addiction level. Now, when you talk to a counselor, what you want to be clear about is what this actually looks like. If their video game use is incredibly high, or if it's just more use than you feel like should be necessary. So if someone's spending all of their waking time or all their free time involved in video games, despite going to school, going to work, whatever may be happening in that moment, then that might be a level of, there might be a video game use disorder going on. But simply because your kid is spending too much time on video games, maybe, they spend the majority of the day on Saturday playing video games. That really needs to be evaluated by a counselor to see if, is this really an overuse, or is this just something we need to find other activities or replacement stuff for? So never self-diagnose your kids. It's always better to have the professional to help guide you in that and recommend what needs done and what would be helpful and whether they even meet criteria. One thing that's important to know about video game use and addictions is that, this might be something that is pretty common with teens and children when it comes to using it as coping skills. We all have those things that we do in our life that we use to kind of get away and escape from some of our troubles. Many of us prefer watching TV or maybe spending time with friends, reading books, maybe going for walks. Well, with the new digital age, this is one of the things that kids spend a lot of time on. And it may be something that if they've done long enough, they found it to be an escape from real life, to be used as a coping mechanism. So we want to be careful if this is something that your child uses to cope with, their daily stress or anxiety or depression or something else that may be going on underneath it. Because if we diagnose this as an addiction and begin to challenge it without replacing it with appropriate coping strategies, then it's going to cause a bigger deal of problems. Maybe the underlying problem is your kid is experiencing mild or moderate anxiety. If that's happening, then that's something that needs to be diagnosed and discussed with a counselor or some kind of therapist. So that way you can treat the underlying anxiety and be able to find adaptive and more appropriate escapes or coping mechanisms for that anxiety versus just video game use. And oftentimes you'll see that video game use will decrease as, whatever is driving it, be that anxiety or other stress, is reduced in someone's life. We also have to acknowledge that video game is a cultural thing now. A lot of children like to socialize and engage in that culture. And so that might be something to consider. Is my child just identifying as a gamer? Now, I'm not trying to say that we should disregard, if they say that they're a gamer and they play video games all the time, that we shouldn't really step in and try and help them with that. What I am saying is, does your child spend time playing video games because this is how they spend time with their friends? We just went through a recent season where a lot of us had to stay home and we couldn't connect in person. And so because of that, a lot of kids turn to spending time with friends and video games. So have they been using that as their social engagement, which is an important thing, but it doesn't necessarily replace in-person engagement. So we need to be careful about evaluating that and seeing, is this how my kid spends time with their friends? And if so, how can we better regulate that time with friends? Is there another way that they can hang out with friends? Or should we just moderate that time simply by saying, if from 4 o'clock to dinner time, you want to get on video games so that way that can be your social time. As long as you're spending time with friends, that's okay. As long as you're playing games together, that's great. And just being aware of that, so that way we're not taking away that important social interaction that some of our kids may be having in that time. Something else to consider is escapism, that some kids use video games as a way to escape real life because there's something maybe hurting them or affecting them, and it's just a way for them to detach from reality. Now, this can be kind of dangerous because this will cause kids to want to use video games as a way to feel good about themselves, to be in a place where they actually feel like they can exist, where they can feel wanted, feel desired, feel accomplished. And if your child experiences this escapism with video games, that's something else that they would want to work through with a counselor, because you want to make sure that they feel comfortable and able to participate in real life. When they're using it as an escape, that means that there's something missing that's valuable or that's feels good about real life. So we want to be careful to understand, is this something that they're using to escape? Or is this something that they're using to feel accomplished, that they feel good about in life? Because if these factors are going on, we need to be very careful about that. So again, I bring up all this stuff to say this is things to consider. If you're believing that your kid overuses video games and you're seeing some of these symptoms, go talk to a counselor, talk to a professional, come in and consult with us at Care to Change. We can talk to you and see, is this really video game overuse? Is there something more going on? Are there things to consider about what's going on? Or should it just simply be, we moderate and reduce the video game time? So I want to leave you with 4 practical tips to take home from this presentation. So that way, you know kind of what things to do, what steps to take, and how to be able to help your child that may be struggling with too much video game use. The first is take interest in your child's interests. This is a very important first step, because the more that you participate in the life of your child, the more you'll be able to understand what's going on. Is this a video game use disorder, or is this just simply a hobby, a pastime that they really enjoy spending time with? So make time for your relationship with your kids. In fact, sometimes I advocate that parents spend time playing video games with their kids. If there's a game that you guys have in common, something that you can share and doing, take interest in that.